Picture this. You're a servant in the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg in 1780, carrying freshly laundered linens through the marble corridors when you take a wrong turn. You find yourself before a door you've never seen before, ornately carved and guarded by two silent sentries. As curiosity overcomes caution, and you peer through a crack in the door, what you witness defies everything you thought you knew about Empress Catherine II of Russia. What you're seeing isn't a typical royal court gathering. It's a carefully curated collection of hundreds of handsome young men from across Europe, all living in luxurious quarters within the palace itself. Catherine the Great, the woman who expanded Russia's borders and earned a reputation as an enlightened ruler, maintained what was essentially a secret male harem that rivaled anything found in Ottoman palaces. Before we uncover this buried truth about one of history's most powerful women, make sure to subscribe to Buried Truths and hit that notification bell. We're about to reveal how a German princess who became Russia's greatest empress used her unlimited power to indulge desires that shocked even the libertine courts of 18th century Europe. Catherine II came to power in 1762 through a palace coup that overthrew her own husband, Peter III. Born Sophie Friederich, August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg in Prussia, she had been brought to Russia as a teenager to marry the heir to the throne. But Peter III proved to be weak, incompetent, and completely uninterested in his beautiful wife, leaving Catherine isolated and hungry for both political power and personal satisfaction. The early years of Catherine's reign were marked by brilliant political maneuvering and genuine attempts at enlightened reform. She corresponded with Voltaire, established new legal codes, and expanded Russian territory through successful military campaigns. But behind this impressive public facade, Catherine was developing appetites that would have scandalized even the most permissive European courts. Her first serious romantic relationship after becoming empress was with Grigory Orlov, one of the guards who had helped orchestrate her coup. Orlov was handsome, brave, and completely devoted to Catherine, but he was also just the beginning of what would become an unprecedented systematic collection of male companions. What started as a genuine romance gradually evolved into something far more calculated and extensive. Catherine's approach to acquiring male companions was sophisticated beyond anything attempted by previous monarchs. She established a network of agents throughout Europe, whose job was to identify and recruit young men who met her specific criteria. These recruiters operated in major cities from Paris to Vienna, searching for candidates who possessed the perfect combination of physical beauty, intellectual capability, and social status. The selection process was elaborate and methodical. Potential candidates underwent rigorous evaluation that included detailed physical examinations, tests of their education and cultural knowledge, and assessments of their ability to function in court society. Catherine personally reviewed portfolios containing portraits, biographical information, and detailed descriptions of each candidate's attributes before making her selections. Those chosen for her collection were brought to St. Petersburg under various pretexts, as foreign diplomats, cultural attachés, or members of trade delegations. Once in Russia, they were housed in specially prepared quarters within the Winter Palace complex, living spaces that were luxurious beyond the dreams of most European nobility, but were essentially gilded cages, designed to keep Catherine's collection secure and accessible. The living arrangements for Catherine's male companions were extraordinary by any standard. Each man was provided with his own apartment, complete with fine furniture, extensive libraries, and access to the palace's recreational facilities. They wore clothing made from the finest materials, dined on delicacies imported from across Europe, and had servants to attend to their every need. In material terms, they lived better than most princes, but comfort came at the price of freedom. The men in Catherine's collection were essentially prisoners, albeit luxurious ones. They could not leave the palace without permission, could not correspond with family or friends outside Russia, and were expected to be available to the Empress whenever she desired their company. Their lives revolved entirely around Catherine's schedule and whims. Catherine's system for managing her collection was as organized as any other aspect of her government. She maintained detailed records of each man's preferences, abilities, and performance in various situations. This information was used to determine which companions would be selected for different types of activities: intellectual discussions, cultural events, or more intimate encounters. The rotation system Catherine developed allowed her to maintain relationships with dozens of men simultaneously, while ensuring that none became too comfortable or influential. She would typically spend weeks or months focusing intensively on a particular favorite before moving on to someone new, leaving the previous companion in a state of uncertain anticipation about whether he would regain her attention. The psychological impact on the men trapped in Catherine's collection was devastating. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as depression and anxiety disorders, unable to cope with the combination of luxury and captivity that defined their existence. Some attempted to escape, only to be recaptured and subjected to punishments that served as examples to others who might consider similar attempts. Catherine's most famous companion, Grigory Potemkin, began as just another member of her collection, but eventually transcended this role to become her political partner and closest advisor. Their relationship demonstrated both the potential benefits and dangers of Catherine's system. Potemkin gained enormous power and influence, but he also had to navigate the constant threat of being replaced by newer, younger additions to the Empress's collection. The financial cost of maintaining Catherine's male harem was enormous. The expenses included not only the basic costs of housing, feeding, and clothing hundreds of men, but also the elaborate gifts, entertainment, and specialized services required to keep them content. Palace records show expenditures on everything from imported wines and exotic foods to musical instruments and art supplies for the more culturally inclined members of the collection. Catherine also spent vast sums on what might be called recruitment and retention bonuses. New additions to her collection received welcome gifts that often included expensive jewelry, rare books, or works of art. Long-term members might be rewarded with properties, titles, or financial stipends that ensured their continued loyalty and discretion. The international implications of Catherine's practices were significant, but carefully managed through diplomatic channels. Foreign governments were aware that their citizens had disappeared into the Russian court, but the combination of Catherine's political power and the shameful nature of the situation made it difficult for them to demand explanations or seek the return of their nationals. Some European courts attempted to use knowledge of Catherine's collection as diplomatic leverage, subtly threatening to expose her practices if she didn't agree to their political demands. Catherine's response was typically direct. She would arrange for compromising information about the threatening party's own behavior to become public, demonstrating that she was prepared to engage in mutually assured destruction if necessary. The daily routine within Catherine's collection was carefully structured to maximize both the Empress's satisfaction and the men's dependence on her system. Mornings typically involved educational activities, language lessons, philosophical discussions, or artistic pursuits that kept the men intellectually engaged while preparing them for their roles as Catherine's companions. Afternoons were often devoted to physical activities, riding, fencing, or dancing lessons that maintained the men's health and attractiveness while providing Catherine with opportunities to observe and evaluate their development. The Empress would frequently attend these sessions, using them as informal auditions to determine which companions would be selected for evening activities. Evenings brought the most anxiety-provoking part of the daily routine, the selection process. Catherine would review reports from her staff about each man's activities and demeanor before choosing her companions for dinner, entertainment, or more private encounters. Those selected felt a mixture of honor and dread, while those passed over faced the psychological torture of wondering whether they had fallen from favor. The competitive atmosphere Catherine deliberately cultivated among her collection created intense psychological pressure that served her purposes perfectly. The men competed constantly for her attention and approval, developing elaborate strategies to distinguish themselves from their rivals while undermining potential competitors through subtle sabotage and gossip. Catherine's control extended beyond the physical confines of the palace to encompass every aspect of her companions' emotional and psychological lives. She encouraged them to confide their fears, hopes, and secrets, using this information to manipulate their behavior and ensure their continued dependence. The Empress became not just their captor but their confidante, creating emotional bonds that made escape even more psychologically difficult. The health consequences of life in Catherine's collection were severe and varied. Many men developed stress-related illnesses, while others suffered from the effects of the rich foods and sedentary lifestyle that characterized palace life. Perhaps most tragically, several companions succumbed to what palace physicians euphemistically described as melancholia, severe depression that in some cases led to suicide attempts. Catherine's response to these health problems was typically practical rather than compassionate. Men who became ill or mentally unstable were quietly removed from the collection and either returned to their home countries with substantial financial settlements or relocated to comfortable but remote estates where they could live out their lives in obscurity. The recruitment process for Catherine's collection evolved over time as her agents learned to identify the personality types most likely to thrive in the palace environment. They began focusing on young men from modest backgrounds who would be dazzled by the luxury and status that came with imperial favor, rather than aristocrats who might have the connections and resources to cause trouble. This shift in recruitment strategy led to some of Catherine's most successful long-term relationships. Men like Alexander Lanskoy and Alexander Yermolov, who came from relatively humble origins, proved more grateful for their elevation and more willing to accept the constraints that came with their privileged positions. But Catherine's system also produced some spectacular failures. Several men from prominent families created international incidents when they attempted to expose their treatment or demand their release. These situations required careful diplomatic management and sometimes significant financial settlements to prevent damaging revelations from becoming public. The cultural impact of Catherine's practices extended beyond the immediate circle of her companions to influence Russian court culture more broadly. The emphasis on male beauty and accomplishment created new standards for what was considered attractive and desirable in aristocratic circles, while the obvious power of physical appeal in gaining imperial favor led to increased attention to fashion, grooming, and social skills among ambitious young men. Catherine's collection also influenced European fashion and cultural trends through the men who eventually gained their freedom and returned to their home countries. These former companions brought with them Russian styles in clothing, interior decoration, and social customs that gradually spread through European high society. The end of Catherine's reign in 1796 created a crisis for the hundreds of men still living in her collection. Her son Paul I, who had always disapproved of his mother's lifestyle, immediately began dismantling the system she had created. Some companions were allowed to remain in Russia with pensions and modest estates, while others were given passage back to their home countries, along with financial settlements intended to buy their silence. The records of Catherine's collection were systematically destroyed on Paul's orders, making it impossible to determine the exact number of men who had been part of the system or the full extent of its operations. This deliberate erasure of evidence has contributed to the historical ambiguity surrounding Catherine's private life, allowing later scholars to dismiss accounts of her practices as exaggerated gossip. However, enough fragmentary evidence survived in private papers, diplomatic correspondence, and court memoirs to confirm that Catherine's male collection was far more extensive and systematic than previously understood. The empress who expanded Russia's borders and earned recognition as an enlightened ruler also operated what was essentially the largest and most sophisticated male harem in European history. The psychological portrait that emerges from this evidence is complex and disturbing. Catherine appears to have viewed men as collectible objects whose value lay primarily in their ability to provide her with pleasure, comfort, and validation. Her systematic approach to acquiring and managing these human collections revealed a level of objectification that was remarkable, even by the standards of absolute monarchy. Yet Catherine's practices also reflected the limitations and contradictions of her position as a female ruler in an intensely patriarchal society. Having gained power through her own intelligence and determination, she may have seen her collection as a way of reversing traditional gender roles and exercising the kind of sexual authority that male rulers had always taken for granted. The buried truth about Catherine the Great's male harem forces us to reconsider our understanding of one of history's most celebrated monarchs. The woman who corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers about human rights and dignity was simultaneously treating hundreds of men as property to be collected, used, and discarded according to her whims. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that even the most accomplished and apparently enlightened individuals can harbor impulses that completely contradict their public personas. Catherine's intellectual brilliance and political achievements cannot be separated from her treatment of the men who were trapped in her elaborate system of organized exploitation. Today, as we continue to grapple with questions about power, consent, and human dignity, Catherine's practices offer disturbing insights into how unlimited authority can corrupt even the most promising leaders. Her male collection stands as a monument to the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of treating other people as objects for personal gratification.